Now, China abstained in a UN vote yesterday about the Ukraine war. Beijing has sought to position itself as neutral in the war, even though it maintains close ties with Russia. Now, Beijing has presented a proposal to end the conflict, urging Ukraine and Russia to agree a ceasefire and hold peace talks as soon as possible. A 12-point document was timed to coincide with the anniversary of the war. And for more on this, we can bring in Andrew Small now. He's a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Asia program and an expert on Sino-Russian relations. Welcome, Andrew. I'd like to start off by getting your reaction to this highly anticipated so-called peace proposal, which China published just hours after it abstained from the UN resolution to end Russia's war against Ukraine.
So I think even by the low standards of expectations that there were for this, it was still somewhat disappointing. It was essentially just a recycling of pretty boilerplate Chinese positions on all of these issues. It's certainly not a plan, and it doesn't do anything to advance peace. It wasn't consulted with the Ukrainian side. So I think some analysts were perhaps looking for there to be some interesting twist, some new angle, something that it did that might be slightly different from what we've heard from China on these things before. But essentially, it's a reiteration of various general principles, including things like blaming Cold War mentality for the outbreak of the conflict, criticizing various forces for fanning the flames by supplying weapons. So it's really amounted to very little so far, and I think the critical response from most Europeans has reflected that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chinese leadership maintains that it is a neutral party to this war. At the same time, it's calling for a ceasefire, and Western intelligence says that China is possibly planning to supply Russia with lethal weapons to fight Ukraine. So how can we sort of analyse this position?
Yes, it was called by some people pro-Russian neutrality, the position that China took. But the neutrality element is becoming weaker and weaker. I think in recent weeks, not only have we heard the reports of considerations on the Chinese side about lethal supplies from the Chinese side, including the story overnight specifically about armed drones. But there's a lot more material that's come out on the dual-use goods that China's been providing, whether it's semiconductors that have been showing up in Russian weapons, commercial drones, but lots of kind of areas in which they've been resupplying Russia with spare parts and other things. So you've got, I think, a context now in which the growing concern is that China is providing a backdrop of material support for Russia in this war, and the concern is that this could get worse in the weeks and months ahead. So I think it's become harder to maintain the position of neutrality, whatever the political and diplomatic language that they're using on this.
And of course, China's top diplomat met with President Putin in Moscow on Wednesday, and the Chinese president is expected to visit soon. So how would you describe the relationship between the two nations? I mean, would you say it's a sort of transactional marriage of convenience, or how do you see it?
I don't think it's just transactional. I mean, there is, as we saw from the joint statement a year ago, shortly before the outbreak of war, a certain ideological dimension to the relationship, particularly in the mindset that Xi Jinping has around this. But I think the critical part of it is that from China's perspective, Russia is able to operate as a pretty full-spectrum partner in what they see as their wider struggle with the United States and to a certain extent with US allies in the US alliance system more generally. So even when they're disappointed or concerned at actions that Russia has taken, I think they'd hope that Russia would be far more successful than it has been with its invasion. I think nonetheless, this is a partnership that in the wider strategic landscape in which China is operating still provides all sorts of useful things for China, whether it's the huge upsurge in trade and energy ties that we've seen over the last year, or the military military maneuvers that we've seen from the two sides. In this broader context of the US-China relationship, Russia still occupies an important role.
We've got a minute left, but I do just want to ask you, Putin's invasion came as Xi Jinping was said to be eyeing similar moves regarding Taiwan. What lessons can Xi Jinping take from Putin's war in Ukraine?
I think China's learning some military lessons about going fast and hard if they do go ahead with an invasion. I think they think that Russia was, they're taking lessons from the relative failures of Russia at the early stages of the conflict. They're trying to make themselves more sanctions resilient. We see the measures they're taking in that regard as well. And I think they've been surprised at the relative resilience, not just of Ukraine, but of the Western response economically and militarily. So I think it's introduced perhaps a note of caution, but they'll be trying to internalize the military lessons, everything from long-range missile strikes to the information environment that they'll have been digesting over the last year.
Andrew Small from the German Marshall Fund's Asia programme. Thank you so much for that analysis.
And let's get more on that proposal. We are joined by correspondent William Yang in Taipei. This so-called peace proposal has been highly anticipated. What's in it?
So basically, Beijing not only called for the integrity of the country's territory to be respected following the UN Charter, but also criticized countries for using unilateral sanctions and also long-arm jurisdictions to basically add fuel to the fire. And at the same time, they also raised concerns and call for countries to abandon the so-called Cold War mentality. But in here, what we're not seeing is any substance that can incentivize Russia to really change its behavior in the war. And at the same time, there's also the lack of incentive for Ukraine to believe that Russia will stop its fighting and also that will push Ukraine and convince them to go into any kind of negotiation so far.
How is the proposal being received given China's close ties with Russia?
There is a lot of skepticism of the actual incentive and also intention behind this whole proposal. And a lot of the experts are saying and viewing this as more Beijing expressing its own concern and trying to protect its own interests rather than really trying to position itself as a real broker of any kind of peace talk, because there's just a general lack of action that can be seen, and also concrete measures that is just missing from all the wordings that are in the 12 points laid out in the document.
You are sitting in Taipei, in Taiwan, of course, and some analysts, they're looking at Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a possible blueprint, in fact, for China, saying that China is also looking very closely in terms of what can happen. Is there anything behind that, you think? What's the conversation right now?
So I think the conversation right now is also viewing how China is trying to position itself in the ongoing war and also China's rhetorics. And from this peace plan that we see today, it's very clear that China is also very wary of any kind of Western-led alliance that is trying to position itself in the Asia-Pacific, because that is closely around Taiwan. And also China will view the response from the Western countries in the ongoing war in Ukraine as a potential way that the Western countries and democracies will try to unite themselves in a potential Taiwan contingency. So I think right now, Russia's war in Ukraine is really putting Beijing in a very tough position, and Beijing is really finding it difficult to try to convince the world that it is not trying to aid Russia, but at the same time, they cannot afford to lose Russia as a partner and diplomatic ally.
William Yang in Taipei, thank you.
Well, for more, we can talk to Velina Chakarova. She's the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna. Welcome to DW. So I'd like to start off by getting your reaction to this highly anticipated so-called peace proposal, which China published just hours after it abstained from a UN resolution to end Russia's war against Ukraine.
Well, as you said, it has been anticipated. Now it's on the table. And yet, as we know, there has been already a 10 points peace plan proposed by Ukraine. So the obvious question here is why has China actually waited so long to, launch its own peace document first and foremost, and then obviously peace process. So the way I actually understand it, and if we take a look at the document, is that it is quite vague. It has a lot of points that are actually favorable for the Russian position. Think of the point considering the abandoning of Cold War mentality or the unilateral sanctions. So I think that this plan has actually a very different task to fulfill, namely to position China as a mediator, as a constructive player in the international arena, but at the very same time, against the backbone of this 12-point peace plan, we know very well that China has already sided with Russia, and Russia, in fact, has sided with China even prior to taking the decision on making a move on Ukraine exactly a year ago.
So basically what you're saying is China, despite the fact that it maintains that it's a neutral party to this war, it's essentially helping to prop up Russia's economy, we'll say, and Russia politically. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. We talk about a comprehensive support, of course, not in an overt nature, but comprehensive support, including diplomatic, political backup, of course, geoeconomic instruments to help Russia bypass the Western sanctions. And then there is this open question mark regarding the possibility of providing even little assistance to Russia if Russia once again starts struggling at the front lines.
Now, tell us this. China's top diplomat met with President Putin in Moscow on Wednesday, and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping is expected to visit soon. So what's in this for China?
Well, first and foremost, you need to understand that the Chinese perspective, of course, is a systemic one. Here, it's all about preparing for the big systemic conflict that is emerging on the horizon. That means the mutual decoupling with the United States. Everything else is, of course, of secondary importance. And here we have the first important component, namely that nobody wants Russia to be part of the rivals bloc. That means that Russia is not the systemic player, but obviously is still having significant influence in the international relations. So from China's point of view, avoiding a three-front scenario, that means a scenario in which it has to tackle the military escalation in the South China Sea, the military tensions with India along the line of actual control, and then a possibility of security vacuum in the north of its border is an absolute no-go. From the American point of view, of course, it is about preventing of two-front scenario. That means tackling both Russia and China simultaneously on the old continent and then in the Indo-Pacific.
What lessons do you think Xi Jinping has taken from Putin's war?
One of the lessons, I think, is that this kind of military conflicts, and in this particular case, it's a traditional war over territory, not just over population, access to resources, but also over territory. It's an imperialist war. By all means, the main conclusion is that it is linked to many, many risks, which I think is a kind of optimistic message that I don't see a military attack by China on Taiwan in the short term. So this would be one of the key messages. Second important message, I think, is that all three relevant players, United States, China, and Russia, are in fact not interested in a direct military confrontation. So all of this kind of speculation about World War III, I think, is quite unrealistic. But what we are observing is obviously the emergence of a new Cold War 2.0 moment. That means a kind of systemic coexistence mechanisms will need to be found in the future. And Russia is certainly trying to position itself in a better way by actually succeeding in this war against Ukraine. It seeks to get this pole position in the systemic conflict between China and the United States. I also think that, of course, Xi Jinping is certainly going to travel to Russia. This is going to be the 40th meeting with the Russian president in a row. And in fact, the West has kind of overlooked the emergence of this modus vivendi of coordination in all relevant domains between Moscow and Beijing. It's going to be very hard, if possible, in the short term, to actually somehow cut off these relations, these ties in all these relevant areas, which is why I argue that the West needs to come up with a new understanding of this complex threats multiplier coming from the dragon bear, from both China and Russia simultaneously.
Finally, and briefly, if you could, do you see a point at which support for Russia would become untenable for China?
Yes, there is such possibility, which is why I think that China wants to position itself in between. That means to show itself also as a constructive player that comes up with proposals, with peace proposals. And this would be, for instance, the scenario in which Russia continues losing on the ground through successful military counteroffensives by Ukraine. There is this possibility where at some point of time in the future, the cost will be too high for China to continue supporting Russia. And the West needs to also increase the price for China to support Russia in the future.
Thank you, Velina Chakarova, the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy.